you awaken, and suddenly everything loses meaning. Nothing motivates, nothing satisfies. Goals seem empty, people feel distant, and you start wondering, am I regressing? But what if this loss of motivation is actually a sign? What if this silence is the beginning of something much deeper? Carl Jung called this transformation, but the ego calls it collapse. In this video, you'll understand what really happens when the old self starts to die and the new one hasn't been born yet. The answer lies in the place where no one wants to look, in the void. Most people believe that spiritual awakening is the end of the road when it's actually the beginning of a silent crossing. It arrives like an internal click, and right after, a silence nobody expected. What used to bring enthusiasm starts losing its flavor. Goals, praise, recognition, everything seems small. And it's at this point that the ego, without its crutches, starts trembling because something deeper is trying to emerge. This loss of motivation isn't a defect. It's the beginning of deprogramming. When the ego can no longer find the rewards that fed it, it becomes disoriented. Jung's psychology calls this the dark night of the soul, when the self begins to manifest and everything that was noise becomes inner silence. And this silence is unsettling. It doesn't come with answers. It comes with new questions. And this confuses those who still expect to find certainties along the way. It's at this point that many believe they're moving backward. But it's not regression. It's spiritual transition. A phase between what no longer serves and what hasn't been born yet. Nothing is clear, and that's why the impulse is to run back to the comfort zone. But what if this discomfort is precisely the first sign that something more authentic is trying to be born? That's when structures start crumbling. There comes a moment right after spiritual awakening when everything starts to seem faded. What used to spark enthusiasm, an achievement, a compliment, a goal crossed off the list, suddenly seems bland. The loss of motivation is scary because it doesn't come with logical explanations. The person looks around and wonders, am I depressed? But it's not sadness, it's disidentification. The soul is undoing contracts that the ego signed without consulting the heart. It's strange because life continues the same, but you're no longer the same. Superficial conversations bother you. Hobbies lose their appeal. Even what seemed important before now sounds mechanical. Jung's psychology would call this an existential crisis, a break from the old meanings that once served as fuel, and that fuel has run out. But the new hasn't arrived yet. So you feel like you're in the middle of a tunnel where neither the light from where you came nor the light of your destination is visible. And here lies the danger. Trying to force enthusiasm where it no longer exists. Going back to old habits, insisting on empty relationships, seeking distractions like someone looking for immediate relief. But this loss of meaning is actually an invitation, a call to look beyond visible structures. Because if nothing satisfies anymore, maybe it's because what you're really searching for doesn't have a name yet. And it's in this void that the next revelations begin to form. The human mind has a sophisticated ability, inventing, meaning. Wake up, chase after things, conquer. Everything seems to make sense until the moment it doesn't anymore. Jung claimed that many of our goals are just elaborate attempts to escape the void. The loss of motivation, at this point in the journey, is inevitable. Because when spiritual awakening happens, these artificial constructions, goals, positions, even the idea of success, start silently crumbling from within. It's like the stage collapsing in the middle of the play. The lights go out, the script disappears, and you find yourself improvising in front of an audience that's not even there anymore. What seemed to have purpose reveals itself as distraction. And the most disconcerting part, there's no other script waiting in the wings. The ego tries to rescue the old plot, but the self demands space. Then a clearing emerges within you, strange, silent, and empty. And despite the fear, this clearing is sacred. This is the moment when an invisible choice arises. Continue clinging to meanings that no longer work, or allow the soul to start speaking them. But beware, it doesn't speak like the ego. It doesn't shout, doesn't demand, doesn't make promises. It whispers, and only those who silence themselves can hear. That's why spiritual transition seems like stagnation to external eyes. But inside, something is stirring, something that will completely redefine what you understand as purpose. When the ego loses command, life seems to stop. Desires disappear, wants empty out, and that inner voice that always knew what it wanted goes silent. But it's not apathy, it's a psychic reorganization. The loss of motivation at this stage isn't a sign of failure. It's the internal system itself recognizing that the old way of functioning no longer serves the ego, which always dictated the rhythm, now needs to make room for the self. And it doesn't give in without a fight. The existential crisis intensifies without goals to fulfill, without urgencies to resolve. A question emerges that no one wants to face. If I don't want anything, who am I? And this question doesn't have a quick answer. It's in this gap between wanting and being that space is born for deep self-knowledge. And paradoxically, it's there that inner silence begins to become fertile. What seems like collapse might actually be the beginning of a new way of living. A real example of this happens with someone who, after years in a prestigious career, wakes up one day with no desire to continue, not from exhaustion, but because something deeper started calling. Motivation doesn't disappear. It changes sources, and the new source isn't external. It's internal, symbolic, invisible. And when this calling begins to be heard, the old self starts losing strength. And the new one doesn't have a face yet, but it already has a voice. It's common to think, before I was productive, now I can barely get out of bed. The feeling of regression hits hard. But what seems like a step backward is often a strategic pause. The psyche is reallocating energy. The soul, after spiritual awakening, no longer wants to run. It wants silence. And in this inner silence, something is being reorganized. The old rhythm dictated by the ego is replaced by a more sensitive listening, more attuned to internal truth. This spiritual transition requires time. It's like land that needs to be left to rest before generating a new harvest. Jung understood this as a process of individuation. The ego loses protagonism, and the self begins to lead the journey. But the self doesn't work with deadlines. It works with integration. The body feels, the mind finds it strange, the world judges, but inside, an ancient wisdom is at work, and there's no way to accelerate what is organic. Many confuse this phase with laziness or weakness. But if you've read The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, you know that sometimes stillness is more powerful than 1,000 actions. At these times, the most sensible thing might be to stop. Read something that nourishes, and like Jung's Red Book, write, breathe, or just watch the sky for 20 minutes. Small acts that, seen from the outside, seem inert, but inside, they're seeds being planted, and they know when to sprout. Most people fear the void. They try to fill it with tasks, noise, distractions. But after spiritual awakening, this void appears as an inevitable visitor, and it cannot be ignored. It's as if everything went silent, not just on the outside, but inside too. Jung saw this moment as the perfect opportunity to hear the soul, and that's where the turnaround happens. This void isn't absence, it's preparation, and preparation requires presence. At first, it's uncomfortable. It feels like something is missing, when actually it's the excess that finally started leaving. The loss of motivation is the signal that the ego has stopped pushing its agenda. And for the first time, the self begins to emit signals. Gentle, symbolic, almost imperceptible. But to hear them, you need to endure the silence. You need courage to sit with yourself, without masks, without haste, without what for. The soul is shy. It only reveals itself in the dark. Think of that moment when you're doing nothing, and suddenly an idea emerges, or a forgotten feeling reappears. It wasn't chance, it was listening. Reading authors like Clarice Lispector or Rainer Maria Rilke can help translate this strange sensation of being between worlds. They write from the same place, the space between noise and revelation. And it's exactly there, in this sacred interval, that something begins to take shape. Even without having a form yet, the ego wants everything yesterday. It measures the journey's value by the number of results. But the soul, it has another time. A time that isn't measured in clocks, but in cycles. After spiritual awakening, it's common to feel suspended in time, as if life had gone into slow motion. It's not by accident. Spiritual transition isn't a straight line. It's a spiral. And in this process, what seems like stagnation might actually be gestation. During this phase, the loss of motivation can seem like an abyss. But in Jung's psychology, this dead time is fertile. It's the interval where the unconscious reorganizes everything: beliefs, desires, identity itself. It can last weeks, months, even years, and that's okay. The soul doesn't operate on productivity culture's timeline. It doesn't want you to hurry. It wants you to align, because what's being born requires depth, not haste. Think of a seed buried in the earth. It's invisible, but it's alive. It's preparing, absorbing nutrients, waiting for the right moment. This is how the individuation process works: internal, silent, essential. To get through this phase, it can help to dive into practices that welcome the soul's rhythm, like contemplating nature, taking walks without destination, or reading works like Women Who Run with the Wolves by Clarissa Pinkola Estes. And even without noticing, something inside you has already started moving. There's a moment when the void becomes unbearable. And it's exactly then that the trap appears, trying to go back to who you were before, reliving old habits, rescuing that identity that worked so well. Apparently, but now, something inside you already knows the truth, that no longer represents you. Going back would be like wearing clothes that don't fit anymore. Uncomfortable, tight, suffocating. And the ego, desperate for control, will try to convince you it's better than enduring uncertainty. But this return to the old self is treacherous. It might seem like relief, but it's self-abandonment. Spiritual awakening has already revealed that that version was sustained by others, expectations, by artificial motivation that didn't come from the soul. Jung's psychology reminds us that every attempt to avoid individuation is, in essence, a delay of our own evolution. And going backward, at this point, is like trying to unsee something that's already been seen. Impossible. Because now you feel the weight of falseness in what used to be automatic. Examples are many people who, after disconnecting from a corporate life that drained their soul, try to refit into that same world just because the new hasn't shown the way yet. Old relationships reappear. Old vices seem welcoming, but they're just shadows of what once was. The true crossing requires courage to continue, even without a map. And it's in this darkness that the first signs begin to appear. Small but impossible to ignore. Even when motivation disappears and the internal world seems suspended, there are signs, subtle but powerful, that you're going in the right direction. They don't shout. They whisper. A strange dream that repeats, an unlikely encounter, an unexplained shiver. Jung's psychology would call this synchronicity, small coincidences that carry meaning. And those who've gone through spiritual awakening know these signs aren't products of imagination. They're symbolic responses from the unconscious. The self begins sending messages in unexpected ways. You notice you're more sensitive. You perceive when something doesn't resonate. You feel the weight of empty words and feel at peace in silence. There might still be an existential crisis in progress, but behind it, a new perception is born, something invisible is guiding. And at this point, the ego's logic begins to give way to a deeper trust, even without concrete proof. This isn't regressing. This is realigning with what you've always been. Examples appear in simple situations: a book that falls into your hands with a precise message, unexpected advice from someone you barely know, a moment of inner silence where everything makes sense, even without words. At these times, it can help to record your dreams, meditate, or study Jungian archetypes, because the unconscious is speaking, and it doesn't waste words. Each sign is a reminder you're not lost. You're just learning to navigate differently. Without warning, it arrives, after so much silence, so much searching that led nowhere. something begins to stir inside you. A different desire. It's no longer about proving anything, not about pleasing, not about conquering. The new motivation isn't loud. It's like a discreet ember that warms without consuming. And the most curious thing, it doesn't need justification. It simply exists. Because now, it's no longer the ego driving, it's the self. This desire is born from inner truth, not from imposed goals. It has no relation to getting there, but to being here. A simple action, like writing, caring for a plant, listening to someone with presence, begins to have a flavor that nothing external brought. You realize you're acting not to be accepted, but because that expresses who you are. It's the phase where deep self-knowledge begins to translate into visible choices, coherence, wholeness, clarity, all without haste. Look, for example, at people who completely change careers without having absolute certainty, just because they feel deep down that it's right. They don't want fame, just truth. Often, this impulse is born after a long period of spiritual transition. Reading authors like Joseph Campbell or Ram Dass can strengthen this new internal axis, because this motivation doesn't need stages. It just needs space to exist. And when it grows, the internal world transforms. Nobody warns you, but the spiritual awakening process is profoundly inconvenient. It comes to disorganize, not to beautify. Relationships dissolve. Certainties fall, plans die. And in the middle of all this, the sensation of being adrift emerges. But it's precisely in this mess that the soul finds space to breathe. The loss of motivation that seemed like a problem now shows its true role, breaking with what was convenient, but false. Because only in discomfort does truth begin to reveal itself. The existential crisis that accompanies this journey isn't a mistake in the path. It is the path. Spiritual transition asks for courage to let go of the old without guarantees of the new. There are no shortcuts, no ready answers. Just questions that change form every week. And even so, in the middle of this chaos, there's a different freedom. You begin to realize you no longer need to conform to what others expect of you. The search now is for wholeness, not for acceptance. Want an example? That person who was always seen as strong, decisive, and suddenly needs to admit they no longer know what they want. It's painful, yes, but it's liberating, because in this moment, they're not failing. They're coming home. And to get through this phase, it's possible to find support in practices, solitary walks, like therapeutic writing, or works like The Hero with 1,000 Faces by Joseph Campbell. Because this journey still holds one last revelation. There comes a moment when silence, once uncomfortable, becomes home. What seemed empty now pulses with meaning. The old motivation, the one that depended on urgency, applause, or comparison, was left behind. What's born in its place is something more stable, more authentic, almost invisible to the world's eyes. After spiritual awakening, life stops being about performance and becomes about presence. The self doesn't shout. It guides with firmness and gentleness. This phase is marked by a new desire, silent but constant, a desire to live with truth, to express what has soul, even if this doesn't fit common standards. And this changes everything, choices, relationships, rhythm. It's as if finally, purpose stopped being an unreachable goal and became a way of existing. An internal state. Inner silence becomes a fertile field where ideas, relationships, and actions coherent with who you really are sprout. There are those who rediscover the pleasure of teaching, writing, creating something simple like a garden, not to show off, but to nurture. People who went through the dark night of the soul and today live in peace, even without guarantees. Motivation returned, yes, but it came from within, and it's not afraid of the void, because now it knows the void is the place where everything begins. But this realization isn't the end, it's the beginning of a new way of walking. If you made it this far, it's because something in you recognized this journey. Maybe you're living through the silence now, the suspension, the loss of motivation, and even without understanding everything, you felt you're not alone. Spiritual awakening isn't about constant light. It's about crossing shadows with awareness. So the question now is, what inside you needs to die so something new can be born? Stop for a few minutes and reflect. What have you been avoiding listening to in your inner silence? What are you still trying to revive, even though it's already died inside you? And most importantly, are you willing to allow yourself the discomfort of transformation? Share here in the comments what resonated most with you. Was it some specific part of the journey? A sign? A feeling? If this made sense, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This way, you'll keep receiving content that deepens your self-knowledge and spiritual transition. And don't stop here. At the end of this video, click on the next content that will appear on the screen. There, we'll explore another essential point of Jung's psychology that will expand your consciousness even more.